The crisp autumn evening wrapped around the city like a familiar blanket as Ashley made her way down Monroe Street. The street lamps had just flickered to life, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. At 16, she carried herself with the kind of quiet confidence that came from being both an honor student and a dedicated community volunteer. Her debate team practice had run later than usual. They were preparing for the state championships, and every minute of practice counted. Ashley checked her phone. 6:45 p.m. Her bus would arrive in 7 minutes, and she still had 2 blocks to go. Adjusting her backpack filled with debate notes and homework, she picked up her pace. The local shops were starting to close for the day. Mr. Chen was pulling down the shutters of his grocery store, and he gave Ashley a friendly wave as she passed. She'd spent countless afternoons helping elderly customers carry their groceries to their cars, refusing any payment except for the occasional hard candy Mr. Chen would slip into her palm. "Don't miss that bus," he called out with a knowing smile. Ashley grinned back, her breath visible in the cool evening air as she jogged past. Her mom had always taught her to be aware of her surroundings, so she noticed the patrol car crawling along the street before it even turned its lights on. She wasn't worried at first. This was her neighborhood after all. She'd grown up here, knew every crack in the sidewalk, every friendly face behind every store window. The debate team jacket she wore bore her school's logo, and her student ID bounced against her chest with each step. The patrol car's lights suddenly flashed, and a voice crackled through the speaker. "Stop right there." Ashley's heart jumped into her throat, but she did exactly what her parents had taught her. She stopped, keeping her hands visible, though she couldn't help glancing anxiously at her phone. 6:48 p.m. Her bus would be arriving soon, and she couldn't afford to miss it, not with her big presentation first thing tomorrow morning. 2 officers emerged from the car, their faces unfamiliar in a neighborhood where most people knew each other. Officer Riley was younger, perhaps new to the force, while Officer Turner looked more seasoned, but just as out of place in this close-knit community. "Where are you running to in such a hurry?" Officer Turner demanded, his hand resting casually on his belt. Ashley took a deep breath, remembering all her debate training about staying calm and speaking clearly. "I'm trying to catch the 6:50 bus, sir," she explained, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I'm coming from debate team practice at Washington High. I have my student ID right here." She moved her hand slowly toward the ID card hanging around her neck. "Keep your hands where we can see them." Officer Riley barked, taking a step forward. Ashley froze, her fingers trembling slightly in the cold evening air. A small crowd began to gather. The same people who'd watched her grow up, who'd attended her honor roll ceremonies, who'd supported her community initiatives. Behind her, she could hear the familiar rumble of the approaching bus. 6:50 p.m. Everything she'd worked for, the debate tournament, her perfect attendance record, her morning presentation, seemed to be slipping away as the officers advanced, their faces set in stern expressions that suggested they weren't about to listen to reason. Ashley stood her ground, terrified but dignified, as her neighbors began pulling out their phones. She silently prayed that someone would recognize her, would speak up, would help these officers understand that they were making a terrible mistake. The evening air grew colder, the street lamps cast harsh shadows, and somewhere in the distance, her bus drove past, carrying with it her chances of making it home in time to finish preparing for tomorrow. Little did these officers know that their next actions would not only change their lives forever, but would spark a movement that would transform their entire department. As the situation teetered on the edge of disaster, Ashley couldn't have imagined that this frightening moment would soon become a powerful catalyst for change in her community. The tension in the air thickened as Officer Turner stepped closer, his flashlight beam harsh against Ashley's face. She squinted but held her ground, remembering everything her parents had taught her about staying calm in difficult situations. The growing crowd of onlookers muttered amongst themselves, their phones recording every moment of the escalating scene. "I asked you a question," Officer Turner said, his voice growing harder. "What's in the backpack?" He gestured to Ashley's school bag, which was practically bursting with debate research papers and textbooks. "Just my school books and debate materials, sir," Ashley replied, her voice clear but quieter than she would have liked. She could feel her heart pounding against her chest, but years of debate training had taught her how to keep her voice steady even when she was nervous. "I can show you." "Don't move." Officer Riley interrupted, taking an aggressive step forward. The younger officer's inexperience showed in his tense posture and the slight tremor in his voice. "Keep your hands where we can see them." More people were gathering now. Mrs. Thompson, who ran the flower shop, stepped out onto the sidewalk with a worried expression. She'd bought flowers from Ashley's school fundraiser just last week. Mr. Chen had come back outside, still wearing his shop apron, his usually cheerful face creased with concern. "Officers, there must be some mistake," Mr. Chen called out, but the police officers seemed to grow more agitated by the increasing number of witnesses. "Step back, sir," Officer Turner commanded, while Officer Riley moved to Ashley's left, creating a flanking position that made her feel increasingly trapped. "I'm just trying to get home," Ashley explained, fighting to keep her voice calm, even as tears threatened to form in her eyes. "My student ID, it's right here." She glanced down at the identification card hanging around her neck, the one that proved she was exactly who she said she was, an honor student at Washington High School. "I said don't move." Officer Riley's voice cracked with tension. The crowd grew larger, their murmurs turning into protests as they watched the scene unfold. Someone in the back shouted something about calling Ashley's parents, but the officers were too focused on what they saw as a potential threat to notice the community's growing distress. "On your knees now," Officer Turner barked, apparently interpreting Ashley's slight movement as resistance. The order hit her like a physical blow. She had done nothing wrong, nothing except trying to catch her bus home from debate practice. "Please," Ashley started to say, but before she could finish her sentence, Officer Riley grabbed her arm. The touch wasn't gentle, and Ashley gasped in surprise. Her debate team folder slipped from her grasp, sending papers floating across the sidewalk like autumn leaves. The crowd's reaction was immediate and loud. "She's just a kid," someone shouted. "That's Ashley from the youth center," called another voice. But the officers, perhaps embarrassed by their mistake or too committed to their initial suspicions, only tightened their grip. Ashley felt herself being forced toward the ground, her knees scraping against the rough concrete. Her debate team jacket, the one she'd earned through countless hours of practice and competition, was getting dirty, and all she could think about was how disappointed her coach would be if she couldn't make it to tomorrow's tournament. Through the chaos, she heard more sirens approaching. Red and blue lights reflected off the windows of nearby shops, creating a dizzying light show that matched the spinning in her head. Everything was happening so fast, yet time seemed to crawl by as she knelt on the cold sidewalk. More patrol cars were pulling up now, but these officers were different. Ashley recognized one of them immediately, Officer Washington, who regularly spoke at her youth leadership programs. The moment he stepped out of his car, his eyes widened in recognition. What happened next would change everything, not just for Ashley, but for the entire police department and the community they served. As the truth about her identity emerged, those first two officers would learn a lesson they'd never forget, one that would ripple through the entire city and beyond. The crowd's collective voice grew stronger as more neighbors poured onto the street. Among them was Ms. Wilson, a retired teacher who'd watched Ashley grow from a shy first grader into the confident young leader she was today. She pushed her way forward, her usual gentle demeanor replaced by fierce determination. "That's Judge Johnson's daughter," she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. "She volunteers at the youth center every weekend." The mention of the judge's name caused Officer Turner to freeze, his grip on Ashley's arm loosening slightly. Behind Ms. Wilson, the owner of the local bakery stepped forward. "I just saw her yesterday helping elderly folks at the community center," she added, holding up her phone. "I've got it all on video. She's done nothing wrong." More voices joined in, each one sharing a different story about Ashley. "She tutors my son in math. She organized the food drive last month. She helps my grandmother with her groceries every week." The community's words wrapped around her like a protective shield, their phones recording every moment of the unfolding scene. Officer Riley's face had gone pale as he realized their mistake, but Officer Turner wasn't ready to back down. "Everyone stay back," he ordered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier authority. The growing crowd of witnesses had turned into a living testament to Ashley's character. Just then, a black SUV screeched to a halt at the corner. The door flew open, and out stepped a tall woman in a judge's business suit, Ashley's mother. Her presence commanded immediate attention, her eyes taking in the scene with the same sharp intelligence that had made her one of the city's most respected legal minds. Behind her came Ashley's father, the renowned civil rights attorney whose work had helped reshape police training programs across the state. He moved with purposeful calm, his years of experience evident in every step. The officers' faces dropped as they recognized two of the most influential figures in the city's justice system. "Step away from my daughter," Ashley's mother said, her voice level but filled with unmistakable authority. The crowd parted like a wave as she approached. Officer Washington, whom had arrived moments earlier, quickly moved to defuse the situation. "Judge Johnson," he acknowledged respectfully, then turned to the other officers. "This young lady is a star student and community leader. She runs our Youth Police Dialogue program." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Local business owners continued sharing their stories. The flower shop owner spoke about how Ashley had organized a charity bouquet drive for the hospital. The librarian described her work with the children's reading program. Each testimony painted a picture of a young woman deeply woven into the fabric of her community. Mr. Chen stepped forward again, this time holding his shop's security camera footage on his tablet. "Look," he said, showing it to Officer Washington. "She was just running to catch her bus. I saw her myself. She does this every Tuesday after debate practice." The evidence was overwhelming. Officer Turner and Riley's mistake wasn't just about wrongly detaining a teenager, they had unknowingly targeted someone who had done more for community police relations than many of their fellow officers. Ashley's parents exchanged a meaningful look. Years of working within the justice system had taught them that this moment could be handled in one of two ways: as a lawsuit that would deepen the divide between police and community, or as an opportunity for meaningful change. As Ashley finally stood up, brushing off her debate team jacket, her mother placed a steady hand on her shoulder. The way they would handle the next few minutes would set the tone for everything that followed. The entire neighborhood held its breath, waiting to see how this pivotal moment would unfold. What happened next would transform not just their community, but would become a model for police departments across the country. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected moments, and this was about to become one of them. The police station's community room had never felt so crowded. Just an hour after the incident, Ashley sat between her parents, still wearing her debate team jacket, while Police Chief Anderson paced the floor. The room was filled with an unusual mix of people: concerned community members, high-ranking police officials, and local business owners who refused to go home until they saw justice done. "Last month," Chief Anderson began, his voice heavy with emotion, "this young lady stood in this very room, receiving an award for her work bridging the gap between our department and local youth." He picked up a framed photo from his desk. It showed Ashley leading a workshop with young officers, her bright smile capturing the very spirit of community cooperation. Officer Washington stepped forward, holding a thick folder. "I've been mentoring kids in this community for 15 years, he said, opening the folder to reveal dozens of thank you letters and program certificates. "Ashley here has done more for police community relations in 1 year than some manage in their entire careers." The truth continued to unfold like pages in a book. Photos appeared showing Ashley organizing youth police basketball games, leading anti-violence workshops, and coordinating community service projects. Each image told the story of a young leader who had dedicated herself to making her neighborhood a better place. Officer Turner and Officer Riley sat quietly in the corner, their faces showing the weight of their mistake. The young girl they had roughly handled just hours ago wasn't just any teenager, she was practically a legend in the department's community outreach program. 2 weeks ago, Mr. Chen spoke up from the crowd. "She helped my elderly mother home when she was struggling with her groceries. She comes by the store 3 times a week to check on our senior customers." His voice carried the warmth of someone speaking about family. The youth center director stood next, her voice firm but kind. "Ashley runs our peer mediation program. She's taught dozens of kids how to resolve conflicts without violence." The irony of tonight's events: she trailed off, shaking her head. Ashley's mother, still in her judge's robes, finally spoke. "We could pursue legal action," she said, causing Officer Turner to sink further into his chair. "But that's not what my daughter has taught me about community justice." Ashley straightened in her chair, finding her voice. "I don't want anyone to lose their job," she said, surprising many in the room. "But I want everyone to learn from this." Her words carried the same confidence she used in debate competitions, but with a compassion that touched everyone present. Chief Anderson nodded slowly, an idea forming. "Perhaps," he suggested, "this could become a teaching moment, not just for our department, but for departments across the country." The tension in the room began to shift into something more productive. Officer Riley, the younger of the two officers, raised his hand hesitantly. "I volunteer to help with the youth program," he offered, his voice quiet but sincere. "I clearly have a lot to learn." Officer Turner followed his partner's lead. "I've been on the force for 12 years, he admitted, "but tonight showed me I still have blind spots that need addressing." His humility was met with appreciative nods from the community members present. Ashley's father, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "Change doesn't happen through punishment alone," he said, years of civil rights work evident in his words. "It happens through understanding, through education, and through second chances." The meeting continued late into the night, with plans being drawn up for new training programs, community engagement initiatives, and youth-led workshops. What had started as a potential tragedy was transforming into an opportunity for real change. As the meeting wound down, Ashley caught Officer Turner and Riley exchanging glances with her parents. Nobody could have predicted that their next interaction would lead to one of the most innovative police reform programs the city had ever seen. Sometimes the best solutions come from the most unexpected situations, and this was just the beginning. The next morning, the police department's lobby was busier than usual. News crews gathered outside, their vans lined up along the street, but they weren't there to cover a scandal. Instead, they witnessed something extraordinary. Ashley walking through the front doors alongside her parents, not to file a complaint, but to create change. Inside the chief's office, Officer Turner sat with his hands folded in his lap, looking like he hadn't slept all night. Officer Riley stood by the window, watching the growing crowd outside. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife until Ashley spoke. "Let's talk about what happened," she said, her voice steady and clear. Not to point fingers, but to understand why. The young student's maturity surprised everyone, especially the two officers who had wrongly detained her just hours before. Chief Anderson pulled out a thick manila folder. "I've reviewed the body camera footage," he said, his expression serious. "What I saw was more than just a mistake. It was a wake-up call our department needed." He turned to Ashley's parents, who had spent the night drafting a proposal instead of a lawsuit. Ashley's mother spread several documents across the desk. "We've created an outline for a new training program," she explained. The papers detailed plans for community engagement, bias recognition, and youth interaction workshops. But what caught everyone's attention was the name at the top of the training schedule. Ashley would be one of the lead instructors. Officer Riley's eyes widened. "You'd be willing to work with us? After what we did?" The disbelief in his voice was clear. Ashley nodded, a small smile forming on her face. "Sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've experienced the problem firsthand," she replied. The wisdom in her words made Officer Turner look up, meeting her eyes for the first time since the incident. The local news couldn't get enough of the story. Not because of the confrontation, but because of what happened next. Headlines read, "Teen turns police encounter into training opportunity and community comes together for police reform." Mr. Chen from the grocery store offered his community room for workshops. The youth center opened its doors for joint police community meetings. Even the debate team got involved, helping Ashley prepare presentation materials for the new training sessions. Officer Turner, who had been on the force for 12 years, found himself sitting in a classroom again, this time with Ashley at the front. "I never thought I'd learn so much from someone so young," he admitted during one session. The other officers nodded in agreement, many of them taking notes as Ashley shared her perspective on community relations. The changes weren't just on paper. Officer Riley started volunteering at the youth center during his off hours. he discovered that the kids he once viewed with suspicion were just like his own younger siblings, full of dreams, hopes, and potential. Ashley's father watched all of this unfold with pride. "This is how real change happens," he told the police chief. "Not through anger or punishment, but through understanding and education." The chief couldn't help but agree as he watched Officers Turner and Riley becoming some of the program's most dedicated participants. 2 weeks after the incident, Ashley stood before a room full of police officers, community leaders, and local residents. The training program was officially launching, and she had prepared a special presentation. But before she could begin, something unexpected happened. Officer Turner stepped forward, asking to speak. What he said next would move many in the room to tears and set the stage for a transformation that would ripple through police departments across the country. His words would prove that sometimes the biggest mistakes can lead to the most powerful changes if we're brave enough to learn from them. 3 months after that tense night on the street, the police department's community room looked completely different. Gone were the rigid rows of chairs and stern-faced officers. Instead, the space buzzed with energy as officers and local teens sat together, engaged in animated discussions about their experiences. At the center of it all stood Ashley, now wearing a special badge that read Youth Police Relations Coordinator. She moved between groups, guiding conversations with the same skill she used in debate competitions. But today's topic was far more personal than any debate tournament. They were discussing real-life encounters between police and young people. Officer Turner raised his hand, something he'd been doing more often lately. "I want to share something," he said, his voice carrying a humility that hadn't been there before. "Last week, I saw a young man running down Main Street. 3 months ago, I would have immediately called it in as suspicious activity." He paused, looking around the room. "But I remembered our training. Instead of jumping to conclusions, I simply asked if he needed help." Turns out he was rushing to catch a bus to a job interview. The room filled with approving nods. A teenage boy in the front row spoke up. "That could have been me. Last year, I missed an important test because I was too scared to run to school, even though I was late." His words hit home, making several officers shift uncomfortably in their seats. Ashley's program had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What started as a response to one incident had blossomed into a twice-weekly forum where officers and young people could speak openly about their fears, assumptions, and hopes for their community. Officer Riley, who'd been quietly taking notes, shared his own story. "Yesterday, I was patrolling near the high school," he began. "I saw a group of students gathered in the parking lot. My old instincts said to break it up immediately." He smiled slightly. "Instead, I walked over and found out they were organizing a food drive. I ended up helping them load donations into their cars." The changes weren't just happening inside the community room. Out on the streets, people noticed the difference. Officers were stepping out of their cars more often, engaging in conversations rather than confrontations. Young people were beginning to see the police as members of their community rather than threats to their safety. Mr. Chen, who still kept his shop open late on meeting nights, noticed the change too. "Now when officers come into my store," he told the group, "they know my customers by name. They ask about their families. It's like having neighbors in uniform." Ashley's parents watched from the back of the room as their daughter led another successful session. They'd seen the program grow from a simple training initiative into something much more meaningful. Other police departments had started sending representatives to observe, hoping to implement similar programs in their own cities. The local news had picked up the story again, but this time with a different angle. "Teens' Vision Transforms Police-Community Relations," read one headline. "From confrontation to conversation, a community's journey," declared another. The story was spreading, catching the attention of police chiefs and community leaders across the country. But the real success stories weren't in the headlines. They were in the small moments. An officer taking time to help a lost child, a teenager feeling confident enough to approach a patrol car for directions, a community beginning to heal old wounds through understanding and respect. As the session wrapped up, Officer Turner pulled Ashley aside. "I have something to tell you," he said, his eyes bright with excitement. What he shared next would prove that the program's impact reached far beyond their small community. His news would show that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments, like a girl running to catch her bus on a cool autumn evening. 1 year later, the The city had changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The small community room where it all began couldn't hold the crowds anymore. Now, the weekly meetings took place in the high school auditorium, with hundreds of people attending each session. On this particular evening, Ashley stood on the stage, looking out at the packed audience. Officers in uniform sat next to teenagers in school jackets. Community leaders chatted with local residents. Even the mayor had shown up, eager to see the program that had put their city in the national spotlight. A year ago, Ashley began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had found her true calling. "I was running to catch a bus." She paused, letting the words sink in. That moment could have torn our community apart. Instead, it brought us together in ways we never imagined. The statistics told an impressive story. Complaints against officers had dropped by 70%. Youth participation in community programs had tripled. But the real success stories were written on the faces in the crowd. Officer Turner, now the department's Community Relations Director, stood up to share his news. 5 other cities have adopted our training program, he announced proudly. And 20 more have requested our help in starting their own. The audience burst into applause, but he wasn't finished. The State Police Academy has made Ashley's youth interaction course mandatory for all new officers. Officer Riley, who had become one of the program's strongest advocates, added his own update. "Remember that basketball court behind the youth center?" he asked. "Last week, we had our first police youth tournament. 8 teams participated," he grinned. "And yes, the teens beat us fair and square." The changes went beyond organized programs. Local shop owners reported a new atmosphere in the neighborhood. The old barriers between police and community had melted away, replaced by genuine relationships. Officers knew residents by name, and young people felt comfortable approaching them for help. Mr. Chen stood up from his seat in the middle row. "Last month," he shared, 2 officers helped me repaint my store. They stayed after their shift just to finish the job." His voice grew warm with emotion. "Now that's what I call community policing." Ashley's parents watched from the side of the stage, their faces glowing with pride. Their daughter had turned a potential tragedy into a movement for positive change. The lawsuit they never filed had been replaced by something far more valuable, a blueprint for real community transformation. The youth center director stepped up to the microphone. When Ashley first proposed this program, she recalled, some people said it wouldn't last. They said one person couldn't change an entire system. She smiled at Ashley. They were wrong. One person with the right heart can change everything. As the evening drew to a close, Ashley shared one final story. "Yesterday, I saw a young girl running to catch her bus," she said. "And you know what happened? An officer pulled over, put on his lights, and offered her a ride to the bus stop." The audience laughed, but the message was clear: times had truly changed. The mayor approached the podium with an announcement that would take the program to the next level. The city had approved funding for a new youth police partnership center, with Ashley as its first director. At just 17, she would be guiding a program that was becoming a model for cities across the country. Officer Turner and Riley, once symbols of what needed to change, had become champions of that change. They now trained other officers in the art of community policing, sharing their story as a powerful example of how mistakes could lead to growth. As the crowd began to disperse, Ashley looked around at what they had built together. The scared girl running for the bus had become a leader, the officers who stopped her had become allies, and a community that could have been divided had grown stronger through understanding and respect. This wasn't just a story about police reform. It was a story about human connection, about the power of second chances, and about how the right response to injustice can create lasting positive change. As people filed out of the auditorium, many stopped to chat with officers or make plans for upcoming community events. The barriers that once seemed unbreakable had been replaced by bridges of understanding, proving that sometimes the best endings come from the most challenging beginnings.